She walked into the office of the most dangerous man in New York, not because she was brave, because she had nothing left to lose. One woman, one resignation letter, one locked door, and a mafia boss who had been watching her for over a year without her knowing. What happened in that office changed everything. Her career, her life, and the empire of a man who had never once let anyone close enough to matter. This is The Stay. Watch until the end. Hit like. And drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain came down like the city was trying to wash itself clean of something it already knew it couldn't fix. Vivian Carter stood at the window on the 22nd floor of the Moretti Consortium's headquarters on 6th Avenue and stared out at the wet black street below. She had been standing there for 11 minutes. She knew because she kept checking the time on her phone, then putting it face down, then picking it up again. Somewhere behind her, the last two people from the strategy development team had already grabbed their bags and left without saying goodnight. They never said goodnight to her anymore. She wasn't sure exactly when that had stopped, but it had, and she'd trained herself not to notice. The resignation letter was in her right hand. She'd printed it at 6:47 p.m., while most of the floor was still full, and she could hear voices and the sound of keyboards and someone microwaving something that smelled like bad Thai food. She printed it then because she didn't trust herself to print it when the floor was empty and quiet. Quiet had a way of making her second-guess herself. Quiet had a way of talking her back into another 6 months she didn't have inside her. She folded it now, unfolded it, looked at it again. Effective immediately. That's how she'd opened it. Not 2 weeks' notice, not with great appreciation for the opportunities, just effective immediately. Because if she gave 2 weeks, she would spend those 2 weeks watching Damian Knox parade her ideas around the executive floor under his own name, and she would smile and nod and bite through the inside of her cheek until it bled, the way she'd been doing for 3.5 years. She pressed the letter flat against her thigh and turned away from the window. The fluorescent light above her desk had been flickering for 6 weeks. She'd put in a maintenance request 4 times. The last time, someone from facilities had emailed back asking her to confirm whether she was full-time or contract, as if that changed whether a broken light was a broken light. She'd stopped eating lunch at her desk because the flickering gave her headaches, so she ate in the stairwell between the 18th and 19th floors, alone, with her laptop propped on her knees, working, always working. She picked up her bag. She had meant to take the main elevator down to the lobby, hand the letter to night security, and walk out into the rain and be done with it. That was the plan she'd made at 6:47. But now she was standing at the elevator bank, and the button she pressed wasn't the down arrow. She pressed the up arrow. She pressed it, and she stood there and she waited, and the elevator came and she stepped inside. The executive floor, the 31st, required a key card she didn't have. Everyone on the 22nd knew that. Everyone below the 30th knew that. You needed the gold edge card, not the standard blue one, and the gold edge cards went to 7 people in the building, the 4 members of the executive board, the head of legal, the head of security, and Luca Moretti himself. What most of the 22nd floor didn't know, what Vivian had spent 2 months quietly figuring out by paying attention to things other people dismissed as coincidence, was that the system had a gap. Not a malfunction, exactly. More like a courtesy. If someone in Moretti's inner circle was expecting a late delivery of physical documents, building management would enter a temporary window code for the executive elevator. The window lasted 40 minutes. It was supposed to go to the courier, but the code was always the same sequence, 4 digits anchored to the company's founding year. And Vivian had watched a courier punch it in from 40 feet away 3 months ago, and she had memorized it without meaning to, because that was just how her brain worked, absorbing and filing and cross-referencing without being asked. She punched in the code. The elevator hummed and rose. She told herself she was doing this because she deserved to hand the letter to someone who actually had the authority to receive it. She told herself she was doing it because she wanted a record, a real one that couldn't be buried or misfiled or quietly handed back to Damian Knox as if she had never written it. She told herself a lot of things in those 30 seconds of elevator ascent. None of them were completely true. The true thing was harder to say. The true thing was that she was angry in a way that had curdled past the point of tears, and she wanted, for once in 4 years, to look the man at the top of the organization in the face and make him see what his company had done to her. The doors opened. The 31st floor was almost completely dark. No buzzing overhead lights, no flickering fluorescence. The kind of dark that comes from someone having chosen the dark deliberately, not from oversight. A few low-wattage wall sconces cast amber pools along the hallway. The carpet up here was different from the floors below. Thicker, darker, the kind that absorbed footsteps entirely. The air smelled like wood and leather, and something faintly like rain coming through a window left cracked open somewhere nearby. Vivian walked towards the only light at the far end of the hall. A set of double doors, cracked open, warm light pressing through the gap. She pushed through. The office was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides. The entire Manhattan skyline lit against the storm like something from a film. The desk in the center of the room was dark walnut, old and heavy, the kind of thing that didn't come from a furniture catalog. Shelves of physical books along the only solid wall. A bar cart. 2 reading chairs. A couch against the east wall that looked like it had actually been slept on. Luca Moretti was sitting at the desk. He was not in a suit jacket. His shirt was white, sleeves rolled to the elbows, collar open. His forearms were on the desk, a single lamp lighting one side of his face, and he was looking at a document so intently that for 3 full seconds he didn't look up at all. When he did, his expression didn't change. He was 37 years old, dark hair that needed a cut, a jaw that looked like he'd been grinding his teeth since adolescence. His eyes were the kind of dark brown that registers as black in low light, and they fixed on Vivian with the particular stillness of someone who is never surprised. Not because nothing surprises them, but because they've trained themselves not to let it show. He said nothing. Vivian's hand tightened on the resignation letter. She had prepared something to say. Walking up here, she had arranged the words carefully, like furniture in a room she was about to burn down. My name is Vivian Carter. I work in strategy development on 22, and I am resigning effective immediately. Clean, professional, no shaking. What came out instead was, I needed you to see this in person. He held her gaze for a moment that stretched uncomfortably long. Then he leaned back in his chair, one arm resting along the edge of the desk, and said, Close the door. His voice was quieter than she expected. Not gentle, just calibrated. The voice of someone who didn't need volume. She closed the door behind her. She heard the soft click of the latch, and then she heard, faintly, the secondary sound of the lock engaging. She wasn't sure whether he had pressed something, some button under the desk, or whether she had imagined it, but either way she turned back toward him and she was alone in the room with him and the rain against the glass and the whole city spread out below them in the dark. Vivian Carter, he said. She hadn't told him her name. Strategy development, he continued, watching her process that. 4 years. Originally hired under the Brennan administration before Marcus Brennan was removed. A pause. You designed the Alvarez campaign restructure in 2021. The one that got filed under Knox's signature. The air went out of her chest. She said, How do you sit down? She didn't want to sit down. Sitting down felt like surrender, and she had come up here precisely because she was done surrendering. But her legs made the decision independently, and she sat in the chair across from his desk and placed the resignation letter on the edge of it, facing him. He picked it up, read it. Not quickly. He actually read it, all of it, his eyes moving down the page with the same focus he'd been giving the document when she walked in. When he finished, he set it on the desk and looked at her. Effective immediately, he said. Yes. That's not a professionally prudent move. No, she agreed. It's an honest one. Something moved through his expression. Too quick to name. He turned the letter over on the desk, looked at the blank side of it for a moment, then looked back at her. Tell me what happened with Knox. The letter explains, the letter is a document. I'm asking you to tell me. She looked at him. She looked at the letter sitting face down on the desk, and then something shifted in her chest. Not the anger. The anger was still there. It was always there. It had taken up permanent residence somewhere between her sternum and her throat over the past 2 years. But something underneath the anger, something she hadn't expected to feel in this room, which was the specific and devastating relief of being asked a direct question by someone who looked like they actually intended to hear the answer. So she told him. She started with the Alvarez campaign because that was the first time she had been certain, not suspicious, certain. She had metadata. She had the draft timestamps. She had 3 emails from her own sent folder that predated every version Knox had filed under his own name by 6 to 12 weeks. She laid it out the way she had laid it out in her own head 100 times. Chronological, specific, with dates and project names and dollar amounts where she had them. Then she went back further. The Chen account strategy, the Pacific Rim expansion proposal, the restructured reporting hierarchy she had recommended in a memo that somehow appeared 3 months later in a board presentation as Knox's original concept. Every time, the same pattern. She would develop something, share it internally, and watch it migrate upward through the organization with his name attached to it by the time it reached the people with actual authority. Luca didn't interrupt. He didn't nod in the performative way people nod when they're waiting for you to finish so they can talk. He sat completely still and listened with his entire attention in a way that she found unexpectedly almost unsettling, because she wasn't used to being listened to like that, and she didn't entirely know what to do with it. When she stopped, the office was quiet except for the rain. He reached across the desk and pulled open the left side drawer. He placed a file folder on the desk between them and turned it so it faced her. She opened it. The first page was an internal report she didn't recognize, Moretti Consortium letterhead, dated 14 months ago. Her name appeared in the third paragraph. She scanned it. It was an analytical summary of strategy development output over a 24-month period, cross-referenced with individual employee contributions as tracked through the company's internal project management system. Whoever had written it had gone further than the surface level. They'd pulled email timestamps, document edit histories, presentation build records. The conclusion was on the second page. Clear, unambiguous, signed by someone from Moretti's private intelligence division, whose name she didn't recognize. All material campaign contributions to the following 6 high-value projects originated with V. Carter, Level 3 Strategist, Department 22A. Attribution currently held by D. Knox, Senior Executive, Department 22. A. Recommend immediate review. The date on the recommendation was over a year ago. She looked up. You knew. I knew. For 14 months. He didn't flinch from it. Yes. The anger returned with a violence that surprised even her. Then why? She stopped herself. Restarted. Why is he still here? Why am I still? Why did you let it go on? Building a case takes time. Moving against a senior executive without ironclad evidence creates more instability than it resolves. He said it flatly, without apology, without the corporate softness people usually wrapped that kind of explanation in. For a year, she said. It took you a year. It took you 4 years to walk through that door, he said. We both let it go on longer than we should have. She wanted to argue with that. She wanted to tell him it wasn't the same, that he was the one with power and she was the one without it, and those were not equivalent positions. But she also recognized, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that he wasn't wrong. She put the file down. So what does this mean? She asked. He reached across the desk and picked up her resignation letter. She watched him, expecting him to hand it back to her, or file it, or do something administrative with it. Instead, he tore it in half, clean, deliberate, right down the middle, and he set both pieces in the wastebasket to his left. It means you don't leave, he said. It means you come to work Monday at 7 a.m. and report directly to me. She stared at him. I'm a level 3 strategist. You were. You can't just... I can do most things, he said. It wasn't arrogance. It was just a statement of organizational fact, delivered without decoration. She sat back in the chair and looked at the rain streaking down the glass behind him. She thought about her apartment on the west side with the kitchen table she used as a second desk, and the notebook she kept beside her laptop, with ideas she'd stopped sharing internally because she'd stopped trusting internal channels. She thought about the 11 minutes she'd stood at the window tonight before she could make herself move. What does reporting directly to you mean? She asked. It means I need a strategic advisor who is not compromised by departmental allegiances or personal interest in protecting existing power structures within this organization. He paused. You understand this company better than anyone on the floor above you. I've read 3 years of your work. Without my knowledge. Yes. That's... She searched for the word. Invasive. It's also accurate. He said it without apology, which was somehow worse and better at the same time. You can be angry about it and take the position. Those aren't mutually exclusive. She looked at him for a long moment. In the low amber light, with his shirt untucked and his eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had been awake too long for too many consecutive nights, Luca Moretti looked less like the ghost story people told in whispers on the 22nd floor, and more like a man who had made so many hard decisions that making hard decisions was just the texture of his daily life. She thought, this is a man who has something to offer me that no one else in this building ever has. She also thought, this is the most dangerous offer I have ever been given. I need to know, she said slowly, what directly to you actually means in practice. Not the title, not the, she gestured at the file, the reality of it. What does working in your world actually look like? Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, more the ghost of one. The recognition that the question she'd asked was the correct question. It looks like hard work, he said. Harder than anything you've done on 22. The problems are more complex, the stakes are higher, and the people you'll be working around are not always operating within conventional frameworks. She heard what he wasn't saying. Everyone in the building heard the whispers. Luca Moretti's name showed up in federal investigations that never produced charges. His business trips to Naples and Palermo were reported in the financial press as expansion meetings and quietly understood by everyone who paid attention to mean something else entirely. And if I ask you directly, she said, whether those unconventional frameworks include things I should know about before I say yes, then I'll tell you, he said, that this organization operates in the full spectrum of human enterprise, and that working at this level means understanding the full spectrum, not participating in everything, but understanding it. It wasn't a clean answer. It wasn't meant to be. She looked at the torn pieces of her resignation letter in the wastebasket. Monday at 7, she said. Monday at 7. She stood. She picked up her bag. She walked toward the door and put her hand on the handle, and then she stopped and turned back because there was one more thing. There was always one more thing with her, and Damian Knox had spent years using that against her, her inability to let things rest before she understood them fully. The report, she said. The one in your file. Recommend immediate review. What happened to the person who wrote that recommendation? Luca looked at her steadily. Nothing. Why? Because if the recommendation was clear, and it was 14 months ago, and Knox is still in his office, I'm trying to understand who in this organization had the authority to delay acting on it. There was a pause that told her the answer before he spoke it. No one delayed it, he said. I delayed it. Why? He held her gaze. Because removing Knox would have elevated the three people below him, all of whom are worse. Removing Knox without a replacement of equal or superior capability would have created a vacuum. He let that sit for a moment. I was waiting for the right person to be ready. The implication moved through her like electricity. She didn't say anything else. She opened the door and walked back down the hallway toward the executive elevator, and the carpet absorbed her footsteps completely. And when she rode the elevator back down to 22, she stood in the empty bullpen and looked at her desk with its flickering light and the 4 years' worth of work stacked in neat folders. And she thought, he built his case, and I was part of it. She didn't know whether to feel used or chosen. She wasn't sure those were different things yet. She went home in the rain without an umbrella because she'd left it under her desk. And by the time she reached the subway, her hair was soaked through, and she was shivering, and she was still thinking about the wastebasket and the torn paper, and the particular way Luca Moretti had said effective immediately. Not dismissively, not sarcastically, but with something that sounded almost like admiration for the nerve it took. You were. She had been a level 3 strategist. Now she was something else. What exactly, she didn't fully understand yet. But on the 40-minute subway ride back uptown, she opened her notebook to a blank page and started writing. She didn't stop until she reached her stop. The news moved through the Moretti consortium like a virus. By Tuesday morning, because Monday was consumed entirely by logistics and paperwork, and a meeting with Luca's head of legal that lasted 4 hours, Vivian Carter's name was on the internal directory under a title that had not existed before. Strategic Advisor to the Chief Executive, Executive Division, Floor 31. The blue key card in her bag had been replaced over the weekend by a gold edge one. Her office, not a cubicle, not an open-plan desk, an actual office, was on the 31st floor, 4 doors down from Luca's. She had been on the floor for 48 hours when Damian Knox appeared in her doorway. He was 51 years old, silver-haired, the kind of good-looking that had probably worked on people 20 years ago, and now mostly communicated aggression. He stood with both hands in his pockets and looked at her the way people look at something they're already planning to step on. "Carter," he said. "Knox," she said, not looking up from her laptop. "Interesting development." "I thought so. People are talking." She looked up at that, met his eyes. "People talk about everything here. If I started making decisions based on what this building whispers, I'd have quit in year 2. "Some people are saying things worth hearing," he said. "Some people are wondering what exactly you offered Moretti to skip 7 levels of seniority in a weekend." She held his gaze for a long time before answering, long enough that the silence became its own kind of statement. "Get out of my office, Damien," she said quietly. His jaw tightened. He left. She turned back to her laptop and sat very still for a moment and breathed through her nose until the shaking in her hands stopped. Then she kept working. The whispers were everywhere, and they were not kind. She heard versions of them all week, filtered through overheard hallway conversations, picked up in the bathroom, delivered to her secondhand by the 2 analysts from 22 who had been reassigned to support her. Moretti's newest project, sleeping her way up. Doesn't know what she's gotten herself into. Give her 6 weeks. She had heard versions of all of it before. The framing was different. Before, she'd been invisible. Now she was a target, but the fundamental mechanism was the same. Someone threatened by her existence was trying to reshape the narrative around her into something that made her smaller. She refused to be made smaller. She had tried that for 4 years, and it hadn't worked for anyone. What she focused on instead was the work. Luca had placed in front of her, on her first official day, a brief, 32 pages, dense with financial data and market analysis, summarizing the Moretti Consortium's international expansion strategy over the past 5 years. She read it twice before noon. By end of day, she had 15 pages of notes, 11 specific questions, and 2 structural recommendations significant enough that she hesitated before sending them, not from lack of confidence, but from awareness that these were the first volleys and they needed to land correctly. She sent them anyway. Luca's response came at 11:47 p.m. Conference room at 7:15 tomorrow. Bring the full notes. She arrived at 7:08 and found him already there with coffee for 2, which she registered as a small but deliberate thing. The kind of thing people don't do for colleagues they're planning to use up and discard. They worked for 3 hours straight without once talking about anything that wasn't the problem in front of them. He was demanding in the way that genuinely intelligent people are demanding. Not arbitrary, not performative, but relentlessly focused on precision, on identifying exactly where an argument became assumption, exactly where a projection relied on wishful thinking rather than evidence. He challenged every soft point in her analysis, not to be difficult, but because soft points were where things broke, and things breaking in the Moretti Consortium apparently had consequences that went beyond the financial. She challenged him back. The first time she pushed back hard on one of his positions, a distribution strategy for the Southeast Asia division that she thought was underpinned by outdated competitive assumptions. There was a beat of silence that she felt in her stomach. And then he picked up her counterargument and examined it the way he'd examined everything else, without defensiveness, without ego, and said, "Walk me through the data." She walked him through the data. "You're right," he said. Simple as that. No qualification. She had to stop herself from visibly reacting to those 2 words, because she couldn't remember the last time she'd heard them from anyone above her in this building, and the effect they had on her was embarrassingly significant. By the end of the 3rd week, the rumors about why she was there had not quieted. If anything, the shift in how Luca spent his time, more hours in the conference room with Vivian, fewer in the executive roundtables that had dominated his schedule under the previous advisory structure, had intensified the whispers. Some of them had evolved from personal attacks into something more calculated. Twice in 10 days, work she'd shared in preparation documents appeared in other executives' proposals before the relevant meetings. Someone was watching her output and feeding it upward. She documented it. She didn't say anything yet. She built the file. Because she had learned, in that office on the first night, that the thing about evidence was that partial evidence was worse than none. You needed it complete before you moved. She was learning to think like him, and she wasn't sure yet whether that was a good thing. What she was sure of And this was the thing she lay awake with on Thursday night in her apartment with the rain again against the windows, her notebook open beside her laptop. Was that something in the architecture of her working life had fundamentally shifted. She was being taken seriously, not tolerated, not managed, not smiled at and silently bypassed, actually taken seriously in real time by someone who had real authority. And the complicated truth of it, the one she was still working out how to hold, was that the person doing that taking seriously was Luca Moretti, about whom she could not be naive, about whom she was not naive, a man whose organization was a beautiful polished surface over something darker and more complex than she had the full map of yet. She thought about what he'd said. You can be angry about it and take the position. Those aren't mutually exclusive. She thought about the way he'd looked at the door after she walked through it on Monday morning. She hadn't seen it directly, but she'd caught the reflection in the glass of her new office window just before it closed, and his expression was not the expression of someone who'd made a cold, strategic calculation. She shut that thought down. She turned back to the notebook and kept writing. Down the hall, 4 doors away, Luca Moretti sat at his desk in the dark, with the lamp on and a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, and a folder open in front of him that he wasn't reading. And the rain came down outside, and somewhere in the organization a problem was developing that he didn't have the full shape of yet, but could feel the way you feel, a change in pressure before a storm, the air going tight and strange. And in 23 days, that problem would walk through a conference room door wearing Damian Knox's face in a room full of enemies, and everything that had been building quietly in the 31st floor would be forced into the light. But Vivian Carter didn't know that yet. She just knew she wasn't leaving, not this time. The leak came from inside the 31st floor. Vivian knew it by the 4th week, not because anyone told her, but because the pattern was too clean to be accidental. 3 times in 9 days, material she had prepared, analysis, competitive mapping, a restructured proposal for the consortium's failing European distribution network, appeared in other executives' meeting briefs before the relevant sessions. Not paraphrased, not inspired by. Lifted, with the rough edges smoothed and her name scraped off and someone else's logic applied over the top like a coat of paint, overwrought. She documented it the same way she'd documented everything Knox had done to her for 4 years. Timestamps, file access logs, cross-referencing the distribution lists on her internal emails against who had appeared in which meetings with which material. It took her 11 days to build the map, and when she finished it, the map pointed at one person, Marcus Frey, Senior Operations Director, Floor 31, Office 7 doors down. 54 years old, 18 years in the organization, the kind of man who had survived 4 different leadership transitions by making himself indispensable to whoever sat at the top while quietly ensuring that no one else got close enough to threaten his position. She brought it to Luca on a Wednesday morning, not as a complaint, as a file. She slid it across the conference table and waited while he read it. He read it the way he read everything, completely, without performing attention, his eyes moving through the pages with a focus that had started to feel, to Vivian, less like a management style and more like a biological feature, like breathing. When he finished, he closed the file. He did not immediately speak. "I know," he said. She stared at him. "I've known about Frey for longer than you have," he said. "He's been running this same play for 12 years, usually against people who don't have the documentation skills to prove it." Then why? Because Frey has relationships with 3 members of the executive board that predate my leadership of this organization, and moving against him without those 3 already neutralized creates a board-level problem I'm not in a position to absorb right now. He said it without inflection, pure operational calculus. The European restructure is the mechanism. When it succeeds, and it will succeed, Frey's interference becomes evidence of obstruction rather than competition. The board members protecting him become liabilities to the organization's performance rather than assets. At that point, removing him is straightforward. Vivian sat back in her chair. She pressed her tongue against the inside of her cheek and looked at the window and breathed. "You're asking me to work in an environment where someone is actively stealing from me while you wait for the right moment?" "Yes." "And you think that's acceptable?" "I think it's the current reality," he said. "Acceptable is a separate question. What's your answer to the separate question?" He looked at her directly. "No, it's not acceptable. But the alternative, moving prematurely and destabilizing the board, Damage is something larger than your work product being misappropriated by a man who will be gone inside 60 days. She held his gaze for a long time. The conference room felt very quiet. Through the glass wall, she could see two of Luca's security staff moving through the hallway with the particular unhurried deliberateness of men who were always working even when they looked like they were just walking. 60 days, she said. 60 days. She pulled the file back toward her across the table. Then I need you to do something for me in the meantime. Name it. The two analysts supporting me. I need them moved to a secure internal channel for document sharing. Nothing Frey can access. And I need you to stop reading my work before I present it to you so that if anything surfaces in the building that mirrors my material, the access trail leads directly to whoever pulled it from the staging environment. He was quiet for a moment. You want me to limit my own access to your work? Temporarily. To build the chain of evidence. Something moved through his expression that she'd started to recognize over the past weeks. Not quite respect, or not only that, but something more specific. The particular quality of attention a person gives when they encounter a mind working the way their own mind works. Done, he said. She nodded. She gathered the file and stood. Carter. She stopped. Frey is the smaller problem, Luca said. He was looking at the table, not at her, and his voice had dropped a register in a way she'd learned meant he was measuring words with extra care. Knox has been quiet for 3 weeks. That's not his pattern. She stood still. You think he's building something? I think men who have operated unchecked for 8 years don't go quiet because they've decided to accept consequences. They go quiet because they're positioning. She thought about Knox in her office doorway that first week. The particular way his eyes had moved around her space. Not angry, not dismissive, calculating. I'll watch for it, she said. I know you will. He finally looked up at her. That's not why I'm telling you. I'm telling you because when it comes, it will come fast, and it will come in a room full of people. And you need to be carrying everything you have on him when it does. She left the conference room and walked back to her office and sat down at her desk and looked at the gold-edged key card sitting beside her laptop and thought about the word everything. What she had on Knox was already significant. What she had documented over 4 years, what the Moretti intelligence report had corroborated, the metadata and email chains and draft timestamps, it was enough. She was fairly sure it was enough. But she opened the Knox file anyway and started going through it again from the beginning because fairly sure was not a phrase that won rooms. She worked until past midnight. She went home. She came back at 6:45. She did this for the next 11 days. The thing about working in close proximity to Luca Moretti was that it revealed, incrementally, the distance between the ghost story and the man. The ghost story was what circulated on the floors below. The criminal empire, the federal files that never became charges, the business trips that weren't business trips, the names spoken in certain New York circles with the specific careful quietness people reserved for things they knew could hear them. The ghost story was real. She didn't pretend it wasn't real. The evidence of it was visible in this building every day, in the way certain meetings were conducted without digital record, in the men who moved through the 31st floor with no formal organizational title, in the phone calls Luca took standing at his window with his back to the room in a language she couldn't identify from the hallway. But the man was also real. He worked longer hours than anyone else in the building. He remembered the name of every person he'd spoken with more than twice. He kept a physical notepad, actual paper, pen, and wrote things down in a cramped, impatient script that she'd caught glimpses of and could barely read. He ate badly. He drank coffee at hours that suggested either complete indifference to sleep or a caffeine tolerance built over decades of abuse. He had a younger sister whose name was Elena, who called every Sunday at exactly 1 p.m., and on those calls, his voice changed. Not softened exactly, but the armor came off one layer, the calibrated quality dropped out, and what was underneath was something rawer and less managed. She wasn't supposed to notice these things. She noticed them anyway. She noticed the night, 3 weeks in, when she stayed late to finish the revised European framework, and at 11 p.m. the door of her office opened without a knock, and Luca stood there in his jacket with 2 glasses and a bottle of whiskey that looked like it had been opened recently and said, "You should stop for the night." She looked at him over the top of her laptop screen. "I have 2 more sections. They'll be there tomorrow." They'll be worse tomorrow. I'm in the middle of the argument, and if I break it, I'll spend 40 minutes getting back into it. He considered this with the expression of someone who recognized the logic and found it personally inconvenient. Then he walked in, set one of the glasses on her desk, poured, and sat down in the chair across from her. "Finish your 2 sections," he said. She looked at him sitting there with his glass and the city lit up behind him through her office window. "You're going to sit there while I work? I have my own things to consider." She looked at him for another moment, then looked at her screen. "Okay." She finished the 2 sections. It took 40 minutes. He sat in the chair the whole time, not talking, not on his phone, occasionally looking at the city and occasionally looking at nothing. And once, when she was deep in the 2nd section, saying without preamble, "The Milan distribution node. Does the revised framework account for the change in the regulatory environment post-2023? She didn't look up. 3rd paragraph of section 4, yes? A pause. Good. When she closed her laptop, the glass he'd poured was still on her desk, and the whiskey in it was amber in the lamplight, and she picked it up and took a sip without thinking, and then looked at him and found him already looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, which was the first time she'd heard him say something that wasn't true. She let it go. She went home. She thought about the expression for most of the subway ride, which was not a productive use of 40 minutes, and she knew it wasn't, and she did it anyway. The detonation happened on a Tuesday, not the Tuesday she was watching for, not the Knox confrontation Luca had warned her about. Something else first, because the building had more than one person in it who had decided she was a problem, and Marcus Frey apparently didn't intend to wait for 60 days. It came through official channels, which was the part she should have anticipated and hadn't. A formal complaint, filed with the Executive Board's Ethics Committee, alleging that Vivian Carter had obtained her current position through improper means, specifically that she had accessed the executive floor without authorization on the night she resigned, using security credentials obtained through means that constituted a potential breach of building protocol. The complaint didn't name Frey. It came from an anonymous submission channel. She found out at 8:15 a.m. when the head of executive legal, a sharp-faced woman named Harriet Voss, appeared in her office doorway with a printed copy of the filing and an expression that was carefully neutral in the way of someone who was personally irritated about being used as a delivery mechanism. Vivian read it. She read it twice. Her face stayed still. Her hands, below the desk, were not still, and she pressed them flat against her thighs and held them there. "There's a preliminary review hearing Thursday," Harriet said. 2 board members. "You'll need to address the access question." "The access question," Vivian said. "How you got to the 31st floor that night." "I used the temporary window code for the executive elevator." Harriet's expression flickered. "That code is reserved for authorized couriers." "It's distributed to authorized couriers. There's no biometric component. It's a 4-digit entry that anyone with sufficient observation could replicate." She looked at Harriet steadily. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't do it. I'm going to explain exactly what I did and why, and let the board decide whether the outcome, which has directly benefited this organization's strategic direction, justifies the method." Harriet looked at her for a moment. "That's a confident position?" "It's the accurate one." She paused. "Does Luca know about this filing?" Mr. Moretti was notified at 7 a.m. "And?" Harriet tucked the paper under her arm. "He said," and I'm quoting, "schedule the hearing and let Carter handle it." Vivian absorbed that. Let Carter handle it. Not I'll handle it. Not this will disappear. He was letting her stand in the room herself. She didn't know whether that made her feel trusted or exposed. "Thursday," she said. "Fine." Harriet left. Vivian turned to her window and stood with her arms crossed and stared at the city and thought about let Carter handle it, and the whiskey glass, and the 40 minutes in her office, and the file with her name in the 3rd paragraph that had been sitting in his drawer for 14 months. And she thought about how much of what was happening to her she understood, and how much she was still standing in the middle of without a complete map. Her phone buzzed. A message from an internal number she didn't recognize. "Check your desk drawer, bottom left." She stared at the message for 3 seconds. Then she opened the bottom left drawer. Inside was a USB drive. No label. Sitting on top of a single index card with 2 words in cramped, impatient handwriting she recognized. "You're ready." She picked up the drive and held it in her palm and thought about what he'd said in the conference room. When it comes, it will come fast, and it will come in a room full of people, and you need to be carrying everything you have. She plugged in the drive. The file directory opened. 47 folders, each one labeled with a project name she recognized. Every major Moretti Consortium initiative over the past 3 years. Inside each folder, email chains, document metadata, financial transfer records, internal communications, evidence trails she had never had access to, evidence trails that made her own documentation look like a rough draft. Frey was in here. Knox was in here. 3 board members she hadn't known to look at were in here, their fingerprints on decisions that had quietly redirected credit and resources and organizational authority for years, in ways that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with protecting a structure that fed them. She sat at her desk and went through it for 4 hours straight without stopping. At 2 p.m., her office door opened. She looked up expecting Harriet or one of her analysts. It was Knox. He was not in the doorway this time. He walked into her office and closed the door behind him and stood in the center of the room with his hands at his sides and his face carrying an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the casual predator confidence of the hallway encounter, not the boardroom performance. This was something stripped of performance entirely. This was a man who had just realized the ground under him was not as solid as he'd thought. "You went to Moretti," he said. "I handed in my resignation," she said. "He made a counteroffer." "Don't do that." His voice was tight. "Don't make it sound simple." "It was simple. You spent 4 years taking my work. I ran out of patience." "You have no idea what you've walked into," he said. "You think this is a promotion. You think Moretti saw your talent and he's your champion now. You don't know what he uses people for." She looked at him steadily. "You're warning me. I'm telling you, there's still a way out of this that doesn't end badly for you." "What does badly look like in this scenario?" He met her eyes. "People who get close to Luca Moretti and then become inconvenient don't leave gracefully." The room was very quiet. The rain had started again outside. She could hear it faintly against the window glass. "Knox," she said. Her voice was level. "Are you threatening me or are you scared?" His jaw worked. Neither answer was the one he wanted to give. "Walk away," he said. "Take a different position. Take the reference. Take whatever settlement gets structured. But don't be in that hearing Thursday, and don't be on that floor next week." She stood up. She was not taller than him. She was not louder than him. But something in the way she stood, the 4 years of swallowed fury finding its correct shape at last, made him take a half step back without appearing to mean to. "I'm going to be in that hearing Thursday," she said. "I'm going to be on this floor next week. I'm going to be on this floor the week after that." She picked up the USB drive from her desk and held it between them for just a moment, not showing him what was on it, just letting him see that she was holding something. "And if you walk into any room in this building in the next 60 days and try to make something happen, I will be ready for it." Knox looked at the drive. His face went through something complicated. He left without another word. She sat back down. She put the drive in her bag. She looked at her hands, not shaking, which surprised her, and she breathed through her nose and out through her mouth 3 times the way she did when the pressure in her chest got to a level that required management. Then she opened her laptop and kept working, because Thursday was coming and the room would be full of people, and Knox had just told her without meaning to that whatever he was building was nearly ready. She wasn't going to walk into that hearing unprepared. She was going to walk into it carrying everything. And she did not yet know, could not yet know, that the room Knox had in mind was not Thursday's preliminary hearing. It was something larger, something already scheduled, something that, in 6 days, would put her in front of the most powerful people in the Moretti Empire with nowhere left to run, and only the truth between her and everything she'd built. And the truth this time would have to be enough. The hearing on Thursday was not the ambush. Vivian walked into the board review room at 9 a.m. with her laptop, her documentation, and the particular quality of calm that comes not from the absence of fear, but from having prepared so thoroughly that fear has no useful information left to offer. 2 board members, Gerald Ashworth, 62, Corporate Governance Chair, and Sandra Lim, 58, who had been on the Moretti board longer than most people in the building had worked there, sat at the end of a long table with printed copies of the ethics complaint and expressions calibrated to reveal nothing. Harriet Voss sat to one side as legal observer. A junior board secretary took notes. Vivian sat down, opened her laptop, and before either board member spoke, she said, "I'm going to address the access question directly, and then I'd like to walk you through the context, because the context matters." Ashworth looked at her over his glasses. "Go ahead." She told them exactly what she'd told Harriet. The window code, the courier entry she'd observed 3 months prior, the decision to use it. She didn't minimize it or apologize for it or try to make it smaller than it was. She said, "I did this, here's why, here's what resulted." Then she opened the European restructure summary, 6 weeks of work, 71 pages. And she put it on the screen at the end of the room, and she walked them through what her access to the executive floor had produced for this organization. It took 40 minutes. When she finished, Sandra Lim was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The complaint characterizes your method of access as a security breach." "It was a protocol gap," Vivian said, "one that has since been corrected. I'd argue the more relevant question is whether the organization's interest is served by penalizing the outcome." "That's a self-serving argument," Ashworth said. "Yes," she agreed. "It's also accurate." Another silence. "The complaint will be marked, reviewed, and filed," Sandra Lim said finally. "No further action at this time." Vivian closed her laptop and left the room. In the hallway, she walked to the women's bathroom at the end of the corridor and stood at the sink and ran cold water over her wrists for 30 seconds and looked at herself in the mirror and said nothing. Her reflection looked back at her with the specific hollowness of someone running on less sleep than a person needs and more adrenaline than a person should carry long term. She dried her hands. She went back to work. The 6 days between the hearing and the consortium summit felt like a held breath. The Moretti Consortium's annual strategic summit was a fixture on the organization's internal calendar set. 2 days, a ballroom on the 40th floor of a midtown hotel 3 blocks from headquarters, attendance by every executive above a certain level plus the organization's major investors, several municipal and state officials whose relationships with the consortium existed in the careful gray zone between legitimate business and the other kind, and a rotating selection of international partners whose presence at a Moretti event meant different things depending on which room you were in when you talked about them. Vivian had been included on the attendee list as a matter of course. Strategic advisor to the chief executive appeared in the program. She had spent the preceding week preparing 3 presentations: the European Restructure Summary, a competitive landscape analysis for the Pacific Division, and a forward projection for the consortium's public-facing philanthropic arm that Luca had asked her to develop as part of a broader repositioning strategy. She knew Knox would be there. Every senior executive attended. She had been watching him across the 31st floor for 6 days with the particular vigilance of someone waiting for a thing they cannot prevent, only absorb. He had been very, very calm. That was the part that kept her awake. Not his anger, which she could read and map and prepare for. His calm. The specific quality of it. Not resignation, not defeat. The calm of someone who has already made the decision and is simply waiting for the correct moment. She told Luca on Wednesday night, standing in the doorway of his office at 10:45. "He's going to do something at the summit." Luca was at his desk. He looked up. "I know." "You know what specifically?" "Not yet." "That doesn't concern you?" "Everything about Knox concerns me," he said. Concern and preparation are the same thing in this context. He studied her face. "You look like you haven't slept." "I've slept." "How much?" "Enough." He held her gaze with the expression she'd come to recognize as his version of calling her on something. "Carter. 4 hours, maybe 5. She shifted her weight. "I keep going over the files, trying to find what I'm missing, whatever he has that I don't know about." "You're not going to find it tonight. I know that." "Then go home." She stood in the doorway for another moment. The lamp on his desk cast the same amber light it always did. The city was quiet behind him, which meant it was late. Manhattan never went quiet. It just went quieter, a reduction in volume rather than silence. She thought about the index card. "You're ready?" She thought about the whiskey glass she hadn't touched until she did. She thought about the 40 minutes in her office when he'd just sat there. "What if I'm not?" she said. "Ready." He was quiet for a moment. "You were ready when you walked through that door the first night. Everything since then has been you learning to trust it." She didn't answer. She went home. She slept 4 hours. The summit's first day moved the way these events always moved, staged and orchestrated, the public-facing presentations glossy and carefully sequenced, the real conversations happening in the margins, in the corridors between sessions, in the cluster of suited figures near the bar at the end of the first evening who were not talking about the presentations. Vivian presented the European restructure summary in the late morning session to an audience of approximately 40 executives and investors. She had given presentations before, 4 years on the 22nd floor had included its share, but never to a room like this, never where the people watching her had this particular quality of attention, the kind that evaluated not just the content, but the presenter, weighing each word for weakness. She gave them nothing to find. Afterward, during this midday break, 3 investors approached her independently. She handled each conversation with the same care, attentive, specific, not overeager. Luca was across the room when the third one found her, and she caught a glimpse of him watching over the investor's shoulder with that still expression, and she turned back to the conversation and didn't look at him again. Knox was there. She saw him twice during the morning, once at the back of the room during her presentation, standing with his arms crossed, and his face carrying nothing readable, and once at a table during the break, talking with Gerald Ashworth and 2 men she didn't recognize. She registered it. She filed it. She moved on. The second morning was when it happened. The flagship session of the summit's second day was a closed plenary. Executive board, senior leadership, the consortium's 12 largest investors, and 3 international partners whose organizational affiliations were listed in the program as consulting groups and understood by everyone present to be something more than that. Approximately 60 people in a room with no external windows and no recording equipment, which was standard for this particular session and had been standard for as long as anyone could remember. Vivian was seated at the main table, 6 chairs from Luca, between the head of legal and the Pacific Division director. She had her laptop and her notes. The first 40 minutes went according to the agenda: financial performance, division updates, international outlook. Then Damian Knox stood up. He didn't wait to be recognized. He stood, and the quality of it, the particular physical deliberateness, the way he pushed back his chair and came to his full height, silenced the room in the way that sudden, unexpected movement always silences rooms. People stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. Knox said, "I need to raise a matter that concerns the integrity of this organization." At the head of the table, Luca's posture did not change, not a shift in his shoulders, not a tightening of his jaw. He looked at Knox with the complete stillness of someone who has been expecting this and has decided how to receive it. "The floor is not open," said Harriet Voss from the legal seat. "It needs to be," Knox said. He was not shouting. His voice was level and carrying, and he was already reaching into the leather portfolio in front of him. "Because what I'm about to present affects every person in this room and their exposure to legal and reputational liability." Vivian's hands went flat on the table under the surface where no one could see them. Knox produced a printed document, multiple copies, she realized, because the man beside him was already passing them down the table in both directions. She watched the pages travel toward her, watched the faces of the people receiving them. Gerald Ashworth's expression tightened in a way that meant he already knew what was in it. The document reached her. She picked it up. It was a 40-page investigative summary. Moretti Consortium letterhead, dated 2 weeks ago. Her name was in the title. Internal Investigation V. Carter. Strategic Integrity Review. She read the first page. Her face stayed still. The inside of her chest did not stay still. The document alleged that the European restructure strategy she had presented the previous morning was not original work. It alleged that the core strategic framework had been developed over the preceding 18 months by the Strategy Development Department, Knox's department, and that Vivian, through her unauthorized access to executive-level systems after her appointment to the 31st floor, had obtained proprietary departmental materials and repackaged them as her own analysis. It had citations. It had what appeared to be document metadata. It had email chains she had never seen before, chains that, if genuine, would show her pulling files from a departmental server she had no legitimate access to. She turned to page 12. There were screenshots, time-stamped, her user credentials in the access log, files she had never opened, with her name in the activity record. Her hands were completely still. She made them stay that way. The room had gone the specific kind of quiet that means everyone is breathing carefully. Knox said, "I've provided copies to the board, to our legal team, and to the investor representatives present. I'm requesting an immediate suspension of Ms. Carter's advisory role pending an independent investigation." Ashworth said, "Mr. Knox, the metadata is verified," Knox said. He was still standing. His voice had not changed register. "The access logs were pulled by our internal IT security division 3 days ago. This is not an accusation. This is a documented record." Vivian put the document down on the table in front of her. She pressed her palms flat against it. She looked at the page and she breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth, slow, because the alternative was something she could not afford right now. The metadata was fabricated. She knew it was fabricated because she knew exactly what she had and had not accessed. And she knew the shape of her own work from the inside, the places where her thinking had gone wrong before going right. The 17 iterations of the distribution network model that existed in her own files with all their rough edges, which no version of a stolen document would contain. She knew this. She knew it completely. But the people in this room did not know it. The people in this room were looking at a document with metadata and access logs in her name, and several of them were already having the particular reaction of investors who have just been handed a reason to question whether they are exposed. Luca had not spoken. She looked at him. 6 seats down, at the head of the table, he was looking at the document in front of him. She could not read his face from this angle. She could see his hands, both of them on the table still, which was either the same thing it always was or something else entirely, and she could not tell which. Someone at the far end of the table said, "We should take a recess." Vivian stood up. She did not plan to stand. Her body made the decision before her mind caught up to it, the way you reach out and catch something falling before you're aware you've seen it fall. She was on her feet, and the room was looking at her, and Knox was 3 seats away, still standing, and his eyes found hers with the particular expression of a man who thinks he has already won. "I'd like to respond," she said. Her voice came out level. She was surprised by that. She was grateful for it. "Ms. Carter," Harriet started. "I'd like 5 minutes," Vivian said. She was not looking at Harriet. She was looking at the board members, and at the investor representatives, and at the 3 men from the international consulting groups whose real nature she understood well enough by now. 5 minutes, and then if the room wants me to leave, I'll leave." The room looked at Luca. He said, 5 minutes. She opened her laptop. Her hands were steady. She didn't know how they were steady. Some part of her brain had apparently decided that this was the moment 4 years of controlled fury had been building toward, and it was not going to allow her hands to shake in front of 60 people in a closed room. She connected to the room's display system. The screen at the front of the room, the one Knox had not used, had not needed because he distributed physical copies, came alive with her desktop. She opened the European Restructure master file, the original, with full version history. "This is my work," she said. "This is the complete version history going back 14 weeks. Every revision, every timestamp, every comment and tracked change." She navigated through it quickly, not pausing for effect, just showing. The earliest core framework document has a creation timestamp of September 9th at 11:23 p.m. That's a Tuesday night. I was in this building. I can pull the keycard entry log for that date if anyone would like to see it. She opened the second file. The Knox department's version as represented in his investigative document, the one he'd claimed predated her work. This is the document Mr. Knox's report cites as the source material. She put them side by side on the screen. These are the metadata properties for both files: creation dates, author fields, last modified timestamps. She paused for exactly 1 second. Mr. Knox's document has a creation date of October 3rd. She let that sit in the room for a breath. My document has a creation date of September 9th. He is claiming I stole work that did not exist yet when I began mine. The quality of the room's silence changed. It went from the silence of suspension, held breath, unresolved, to something harder and colder. Knox said, "Metadata can be manipulated." "Yes," Vivian said. "It can." She looked at him steadily. "Which is why I have something else." She opened the third window. This was the file she had spent 4 nights preparing without knowing exactly when she would need it. The complete chain, not just her own documentation, but the material from the USB drive, cross-referenced and organized into a timeline that any forensic accountant or federal investigator would recognize as a professional-grade evidentiary record. Financial transfers, internal email chains, the access logs that showed not her credentials in the departmental server, but Knox's credentials in her staging environment 3 weeks ago, 2 days before the ethics complaint was filed. "These are the access logs for my document staging environment," she said, pulled from the same IT security system Mr. Knox used for his report. She navigated to the relevant entry. These entries show an external access event on October 1st. The credentials used belong to an account registered to this organization's Strategy Development Division. She turned to face the room. "Mr. Knox filed his investigative report on October 3rd. He accessed my staging environment 48 hours before he filed." The room was not quiet now. The room was generating the specific low-frequency noise of 60 people recalibrating simultaneously. Knox's voice, when it came, had changed register. Just slightly. Just enough. "Those logs are not... I have the raw server data on an air-gapped drive that has not been connected to this organization's network since I pulled it," Vivian said. "I pulled it 9 days ago, before your report existed." She looked at him directly across the table. "You accessed my work. You fabricated metadata to reverse the timeline. And you filed a formal investigation against me using evidence you manufactured from material you stole." The word "stole" landed in the room like something physical. Knox looked at the board members. He looked at Ashworth, who was looking at the table. He looked at Luca. Luca stood. The room did what rooms always did when Luca Moretti stood in them. It went completely, absolutely still. Not because he was loud, because there was a quality to his physical presence in a moment of intention that communicated without any requirement for language that the temperature of the situation had just changed, and everyone in the room understood at a cellular level that this change was permanent. He looked at Knox for a moment that lasted long enough to be unmistakable. Then he looked at the 2 security staff standing at the far wall and said quietly, "Remove him from the building." Knox said, "Luca." "Permanently," Luca said. The word dropped into the room like a stone into deep water. Everyone who had ever sat in a Moretti consortium meeting understood what permanently meant when Luca Moretti said it in that register. The investors understood. The international partners understood. Gerald Ashworth understood. And his face went the color of old paper. The security staff crossed the room. Knox did not fight it. Whatever he was not stupid, and he understood the calculation clearly enough. He was walked to the door. He looked back once, at Vivian, and his expression was not angry. It was afraid. The door closed. Vivian stood at the front of the room in the silence that followed and felt something she had not expected to feel in this moment, which was not triumph. What she felt was the specific exhaustion of someone who has been running for 4 years and has just, for the first time, stopped, and discovered that stopping felt less like relief and more like the moment after a car accident when you realize you are still alive, and the full weight of what just happened hasn't finished arriving yet. She sat down. The investor to her left said something she didn't fully hear. She nodded. She looked at her laptop screen. Luca had sat back down. He was looking at her across the 6 chairs between them. His expression was the same one she'd caught in the window reflection on her first Monday morning, the one she'd been trying not to think about too directly. Not ownership, not strategy. Something else. Something she wasn't ready to name in a room full of 60 people or possibly at all. The session resumed. It resumed around her the way water resumes around something dropped into it. The surface reorganizing, the room finding its new shape. She answered questions when they were directed at her. She was precise. She was professional. She held the room's attention the same way she had while presenting the restructure, not by performing confidence, but by actually having it, the real kind, the kind that had just been tested and had not broken. She did not look at Luca again for the rest of the session. She did not need to. But when the plenary finally closed and the room began to move and disperse, And she was closing her laptop and her hands were finally shaking, now in private, now that it was done. She became aware of a presence beside her and looked up. Luca was standing there, not close, just present. The way he was always just present, with that quality of taking up exactly as much space as he needed and no more. He said, very quietly, so only she could hear it, "Are you all right?" 4 words, the simplest question. She looked up at him. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were dry because she had decided they were going to be dry and they were going to stay dry until she was somewhere private. "I will be," she said. He nodded once. He started to move away. Then he stopped and without turning back to her said, "My office. Tonight, 9 o'clock." She watched him walk toward the board members who were waiting for him at the far end of the room, his back straight, his pace unhurried, and she thought about the expression, the one she'd been refusing to name. And she thought about the 48 hours ahead of her, which would be consumed by the legal fallout from Knox's removal, by investor communications, by the documentation that would need to be filed and structured and delivered. And she thought about all of that, and she thought, 9 o'clock. And she closed her laptop and picked up her bag and walked out of the room into the hallway where the air was cooler and she could breathe at full capacity again. And she pressed her back against the wall beside the closed door and stood there for exactly 30 seconds with her eyes closed, letting herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Then she opened her eyes. She had work to do. She made it to the elevator before her legs decided they were done cooperating. Not a collapse, nothing that dramatic. Just a sudden, total withdrawal of the adrenaline that had been holding her upright for the past 4 hours, and the wall of the elevator car catching her shoulder as she leaned into it, and the floor numbers ticking down while she stood with her eyes closed and her laptop bag pressing into her hip and her heartbeat doing something uneven and too loud in her own ears. 3rd floor, 2nd, lobby. She walked out into the hotel corridor and found a chair near the far wall, away from the summit foot traffic, and sat in it and put her bag on her knees and pressed her hands flat against the top of it and breathed. In, out, in. The kind of breathing that isn't about calm. It's about function, keeping the machine running until you can get it somewhere private. Her phone had 14 notifications. She didn't look at them. She sat for 4 minutes. Then she stood up and walked out of the hotel into the afternoon. The city was doing what the city always did, which was existing at full volume without apology. Yellow cabs and delivery bikes and a jackhammer somewhere a block north, and the smell of rain-wet concrete and street cart coffee. Vivian stood on the sidewalk with her bag on her shoulder and her jacket not quite warm enough for the October air, and she thought, Knox is gone. She thought, the room saw it. She thought, Frey is next. And after Frey, whatever is underneath Frey, and this is not over, this was never going to be over after one summit session. She hailed a cab. She went back to the office. She worked for 5 hours. At 8:47 p.m., she closed her laptop, gathered the files she needed, and took the elevator to the 31st floor. Luca's office was lit the same way it had been the first night. The desk lamp, the city behind him, the particular quality of amber light that made the room feel like it existed slightly outside of normal time. He was standing at the window when she pushed the door open, not at the desk, jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled the way they always were by this hour. He turned when he heard her. She walked to the chair across from his desk and sat down without being asked. She put her files on the table. She looked at him. Frey filed a resignation letter this afternoon, he said. She absorbed that. On his own. The board made the conversation simple. He moved from the window to the desk and sat on the edge of it, not behind it, closer than the desk usually put them. 3 of the board members Knox was working with have requested leave pending a governance review. Ashworth? Ashworth is cooperating. A pause. Ashworth was more afraid of Knox than he was loyal to him. That's useful. She nodded. She looked at her hands. The shaking had stopped hours ago, and what was left was a bone-deep tiredness that felt almost comfortable after weeks of running on adrenaline and fractured sleep. The international partners, she said. The 3 from the summit. I don't have a full read on where they land after today. They land wherever this organization's stability lands, Luca said. Today demonstrated stability. Demonstrated that problems get handled. He paused. You demonstrated that. She looked up at him. We need to talk about the European framework next steps. The restructure needs a clean public rollout now that the summit presentation is on record, and with the board situation in flux, Vivian. The use of her first name stopped her. He almost never used it. She realized, sitting there, that she could count on one hand the number of times he had. She looked at him. He said, "The work can wait 20 minutes. She opened her mouth, closed it. She put the files down. "Okay. Are you actually all right? You asked me that already. You gave me a provisional answer." She looked at the desk surface for a moment. The notepad with the cramped handwriting. A coffee cup that had been there long enough to leave a ring. The particular lived-in disorder of someone who spent more hours in this office than anywhere else. "I keep thinking about the metadata," she said. "Not the summit. The 9 days before it, when I had the drive and I knew something was coming and I kept going through the files looking for whatever I was missing." She turned the coffee cup slightly, straightening it for no reason. "I didn't find it. I had everything I needed and I couldn't see it because I was looking for a threat I recognized. Knox gave me a threat I hadn't modeled. And you handled it anyway. I got lucky with the staging environment logs." "You pulled those logs 9 days before you needed them," he said. "That's not luck." She looked at him. "You knew he was going to fabricate something." "I thought it was possible." "And you didn't tell me. I told you to carry everything." His voice was level, not defensive, just direct. "If I had told you specifically what I suspected, you would have prepared for that scenario and potentially not prepared for others. I needed you walking into that room with the complete picture, not a targeted defense." She held his gaze. The specific anger that moved through her was not hot. It was cold and clean, and she recognized it as fair, which was the most frustrating kind. "That's a very calculated decision to make about someone else's exposure." "Yes," he said, "it is. It could have gone wrong. Most things can. And if it had, if the board had moved to suspend me before I could present," he looked at her steadily, "then I would have handled it differently." "How?" "By making it clear to every person in that room that the evidence against you was fabricated and that acting on it had consequences." He said it the same way he said everything, without decoration, without the softening people usually applied to statements that contained implicit threat, just the plain shape of it. "I wasn't going to let you get destroyed in that room." The office was quiet. Outside, the city continued its indifferent noise. She could hear a siren somewhere, moving away. The rain had held off today, and the sky through the glass behind him was the particular deep blue of a New York night, not quite black, lit from below by 10,000 lit windows. "I need to know something," she said. "Ask it." "The first night, when you tore up the resignation letter." She watched his face. "Was that about the organization? The strategic gap you needed filled? Or was it—" She stopped herself, started again. "You've had 14 months of my work. You built a case using me as part of the mechanism. I need to understand how much of what happened between that night and tonight was deliberate architecture." The question sat in the room. Luca looked at her for a long moment. She watched him decide, not whether to answer, but how much of the answer to give, which was different. "The position was real," he said. "The organizational need was real. Everything I told you about Knox and the structure and why I needed someone without departmental compromise, that was true. And the rest," a pause. "The rest was not something I planned." She held his gaze. "I have been running this organization for 11 years, he said. "In 11 years, the number of people who have pushed back on me in the first 10 minutes of meeting me is—" He stopped. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "One." She looked at the desk surface again, at the notepad. "This is a bad idea," she said quietly. "Probably. Your world is, she searched for the word. "Complex. In ways I'm still learning the full shape of." "Yes. And I work for you. You work with me," he said. "That distinction matters to me." She looked up. He was watching her with the same expression she'd been refusing to name for weeks. The one that wasn't ownership or strategy or the calculated attention of a man managing an asset. The one that was just you. The specific and uncomplicated fact of her, in this room, being entirely herself. She said, 9 o'clock tonight was a specific time." "It was." "Why 9? Because I thought you needed the hours between the summit and this conversation. He held her gaze. And because I needed them. She sat with that. And then she stood up and walked around the desk and kissed him. Not tentatively, not as a question, but as a statement of something she'd been carrying in her chest for 6 weeks and was finished pretending she wasn't carrying. His hand came up and found her jaw, and he kissed her back with the particular quality of someone who has been very patient and is now, finally, done being patient. When she pulled back, her heart was doing the uneven, loud thing again, but for an entirely different reason. She looked at him. This is going to be complicated. Everything worthwhile is, he said. She almost laughed. She didn't, but almost. She picked up her files. The European rollout, she said. He looked at her. Something in his expression, the warmth of it, unguarded, nothing held back, made her chest do the complicated thing again. Then he straightened and nodded, and they worked. 3 weeks later, Singapore. The Moretti Consortium's international division had been building toward the Pacific Summit for 8 months. The largest single expansion event in the organization's history, 42 delegations, 300 attendees, a 2-day conference in the ballroom of a Marina Bay hotel with Vivian's restructured Pacific strategy as the flagship presentation. She had been on the ground in Singapore for 4 days when the threat picture changed. Luca got the information at 11 p.m. on the night before the summit opened. He was in the hotel's private business suite with his head of security, a quiet, broad-shouldered man named Carver, who communicated primarily in complete sentences and absolute certainty. When Vivian arrived to finalize the morning's presentation sequence, she knew something was wrong before Luca spoke. Carver's posture told her. The particular way the room was arranged, Luca standing, not sitting, with his phone face down on the table and the kind of stillness that meant he was thinking past what was in front of him. Sit down, Luca said. She sat. There's a credible threat against the summit, he said, specifically against you. She heard the words, processed them. Her face stayed still. From a rival organization, one of the international partners we cut loose after the New York summit went sideways. He looked at her directly. They believe, correctly, that your strategic work has cost them significant leverage within our network. They intend to use tomorrow's session to demonstrate that leverage cannot be taken without consequence. Demonstrate how? Straight, Carver said. Our intelligence puts 3 of their people inside the hotel. We believe the action is planned for the main ballroom session. The opening plenary, she said. Yes. She looked at the table. She looked at her presentation files. She thought about 300 people in a ballroom and 3 men inside a hotel whose intentions had been characterized as a demonstration by a man like Carver, who did not use words imprecisely. We cancel the session, she said. Canceling signals weakness to every delegation present, Luca said. This summit is the rollout of the new framework. Canceling hands them the outcome they want without the action. The alternative is proceeding with a known threat in the room. The alternative is proceeding with a known threat and a security operation that has been running for 6 hours, he said. Carver has people at every access point. We know the faces, we know the positions. We move before they do. She looked at Carver. How certain? 80%, Carver said. And the other 20? Unknown variables. She sat back in the chair. She thought about what 80% meant in a room with 300 people. She thought about what demonstration meant from an organization that operated in the same world as the Moretti Consortium. I present, she said. Luca's jaw tightened. Vivian, if I don't present, they've already won something. The rollout fails. The delegations read the absence as a fracture. She looked at him. You know I'm right. I know you're right strategically, he said. The particular quality of his voice, controlled, flat, the armor all the way up, told her more than the words. That's not the only variable I'm weighing. She held his gaze. I know. The room was quiet for a moment. I present, she said again. Quieter this time. Not an argument, a decision. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Carver. Something passed between them. A communication of the kind that doesn't require language, built on years of operating in the same spaces. Carver nodded once. We'll be ready. The ballroom the next morning was the particular controlled chaos of a major international summit. Delegates finding seats, staff managing logistics, the low roar of 300 people's simultaneous conversations bouncing off marble floors and high ceilings. The stage at the front was lit and ready, the Moretti Global branding across the screen, the podium centered and waiting. Vivian stood in the wings with her laptop and her earpiece and Carver 3 feet to her left. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat. She could feel the particular charged quality of the room, or maybe that was her own nervous system projecting outward. She couldn't entirely tell. She looked at the audience. She scanned methodically, the way Carver had taught her in 3 hours of compressed briefing the night before. Not looking for trouble, exactly. Looking for the absence of what should be there, the presence of what shouldn't. She found one of them herself. Second row from the back, far left aisle. A man in a delegate badge who had not been on any of the registered delegation lists she'd reviewed, sitting with the specific practiced stillness of someone working hard at appearing relaxed. She touched her earpiece. Second row from back, far left. Carver's voice, quiet. "We have him." "3 of them," she said. "We have all 3. A pause. "We move in 4 minutes. You go on in 5. She looked at the stage. She looked at the podium. She thought about the resignation letter and the elevator and the window on the 22nd floor and the 11 minutes she'd stood there before she could make herself move. She thought about every room she'd stood in the doorway of and talked herself into. She thought about let Carter handle it. She thought about the look on Luca's face when she'd said "I present," the tightening of his jaw, the thing underneath the armor that he almost never let show, that she had only seen clearly once before, in the window reflection on her first Monday morning. "Ready?" Carver said. She straightened her jacket. She picked up her laptop. "Yes," she said. She walked onto the stage. 2. The room's roar softened as she appeared at the podium. 300 faces turning toward her with the expectation of delegates who have been waiting for the keynote, who have no idea what is happening on the edges of the room they are sitting in, what Carver's people are doing in the corridors and near the exits, what 4 minutes ago had meant and what 5 minutes ago was about to mean. She set her laptop on the podium. She looked out at the room. In the far left aisle, she saw movement, quiet, controlled, 2 of Carver's people converging on the man in the wrong badge with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this before. No drama, no raised voices. Just a redirection, a hand on an arm, a body moving out of the row and toward the exit with the appearance of a man who has decided to leave of his own accord. No one in the room noticed. She looked to the right side. Same thing, the second man, gone. She looked at the back of the room. The third position, left rear corner, near the emergency exit, was empty. She felt her pulse spike. She touched her earpiece. "Third position is clear," she said, keeping her voice below the room's ambient noise. "Carver, third position is—" A door at the back of the ballroom opened hard. The sound of it cut through the room's chatter, heads turning, the particular ripple of 300 people redirecting their attention simultaneously. Vivian's hands gripped the edges of the podium. A man came through the door moving fast. Not running, but fast, with direction, with the particular energy of someone who is already committed to what they're about to do. He was 20 meters from the stage when Carver's voice came through her earpiece, clipped and urgent. "Get off the stage, now!" She did not get off the stage. She stood at the podium and she watched, and she kept her eyes on the room, because leaving the podium was a signal, and a signal was a statement, and she was not ready to make that statement yet. The man stopped. He stopped because Luca Moretti stepped out from the right side wing of the stage and placed himself between the man and the podium with the particular physical certainty of someone who has made a decision and has finished renegotiating it. The room had gone completely silent. Vivian stood at the podium and watched Luca stand between her and the man at the back of the room, and she watched Carver's team converge from 3 directions, and she watched the man, calculating, reading the math of the situation, finding it unworkable, and she watched him make the decision. He stopped. He let Carver's people reach him. He didn't fight it. The room held its breath, and then Luca turned and looked at Vivian across the stage, and his expression, visible even from this distance, even in a ballroom of 300 people who were watching them both, was not the Mafia Boss's armor. It was a man who had just stood between someone he loved and something dangerous, and was experiencing the particular and clarifying terror of that choice in real time. She looked at him. Her heart was hammering. Her hands on the podium edges were white-knuckled. The room was waiting. 300 people and 42 delegations. All of it suspended in the specific silence that follows a crisis that has just been absorbed before it could fully detonate. She straightened. She looked at the audience. She said into the microphone, with a steadiness that came from somewhere she couldn't entirely locate, "I apologize for the interruption. Let's begin." And somewhere at the back of the room, as Carver's people moved the last man out through the emergency exit, and the doors closed, and the crisis folded itself away into the machinery of the organization that had just handled it, Luca Moretti remained at the edge of the stage, watching her, with an expression that said, more clearly than anything that had passed between them in 6 weeks of late nights and shared work and one honest conversation in an amber-lit office, "I'm not leaving this room until you're done." Vivian began her presentation. Her voice did not shake. Her hands, finally, were still. The presentation lasted 53 minutes. Vivian knew this because she checked the clock on her laptop when she finally stepped back from the podium, and the number registered with the specific clarity of a detail the brain locks onto when the rest of the body is running on something it doesn't have a clean name for. Not adrenaline anymore. That had burned through by the third slide. Something slower and more exhausting underneath it. The physiological residue of standing in a room where something violent had almost happened and deciding, consciously, breath by breath, to act as though it hadn't. The applause was sustained. Real, not polite. She could tell the difference. Had learned to tell it in boardrooms and conference halls over 4 years of being the person whose work generated applause that got redirected to someone else's name. This applause had her name on it. She stood at the podium and received it and felt distantly that she should feel more than she did. The triumph should feel larger than this quiet, hollow, bone-tired thing sitting in her chest. She closed her laptop. She walked off the stage. Luca was in the right wing where she'd seen him last. He hadn't moved. He was standing with his jacket back on, and his arms at his sides, and his face carrying the specific blankness of a man who has just made himself very still over something that was not still at all. She walked up to him and stopped. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she said, "You stepped out there." "Yes." "That wasn't the operational plan." "No." She looked at him. His jaw was set. There was a tension in the set of his shoulders that she recognized as the physical residue of a decision made at speed from somewhere below the rational level, the kind of decision the body makes before the mind catches up and starts arguing about it. "You could have," she started. "I know," he said. "If he'd been—" "I know." His voice was quiet. Flat. The kind of flat that means the words are doing maximum work with minimum decoration. "I know what it could have been. I made the choice anyway." She looked at him for a long moment. The wing of the stage was narrow, and the sounds of the ballroom were muffled through the backdrop, and the light here was the utilitarian white of backstage spaces. Not amber, not flattering, just honest. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been running a very large and very complicated machine for a very long time and had just in one unplanned moment let something personal override the machine. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. He looked past her toward the ballroom. "The debrief with Carver is in 20 minutes. The delegation receptions start at 6. A pause. "You should eat something before 6. "I'm fine." "You haven't eaten since this morning." She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Because I was watching." She almost said something, stopped herself, picked up her laptop bag. They walked out of the wing together. The debrief with Carver lasted 2 hours and covered the operational picture with a thoroughness that left nothing comfortable in its wake. The 3 men in the ballroom had been part of a network affiliated with a Macau-based syndicate called the Sheng Group, an organization that had held distribution partnerships with several Moretti International divisions for the better part of a decade until the new Pacific framework, built on Vivian's restructured competitive analysis, had made those partnerships economically non-viable and strategically redundant. The Moretti legal team had executed the contract terminations cleanly and within the terms of the agreements. The Sheng Group had apparently decided that clean and legal terminations still required a response. The 3 men were in Singapore police custody. The event would be managed through back channels that Carver described with the particular matter-of-fact brevity of someone who had managed these channels many times before. There would be no public incident. The summit delegations would receive a brief communication characterizing the disturbance as a resolved security matter. Long-term exposure? Luca asked. Sheng Group loses face internally for a failed action, Carver said. That typically means internal reorganization for 6 to 12 months. They won't move again during that window. And after the window? Carver met his eyes. After the window, that's a different conversation. Vivian sat across the table and listened and took notes with the part of her brain that was still operational, and the part that wasn't operational was sitting very quietly with the knowledge that she was now fully and without any remaining ambiguity inside the world Luca had described on the first night. The full spectrum of human enterprise. Not participating in everything, but understanding it. She understood it now. When Carver left, she and Luca sat at the table for a moment in the silence of a room that had just been emptied. The Sheng Group, she said. Yes. The contract terminations came from my restructure. Yes. She looked at the table. I need to know, going forward, when my work affects these kinds of relationships, I need to know the exposure picture before we execute, not after. He looked at her steadily. That's a reasonable requirement. I'm not asking for everything. I'm not asking to be read into every operational detail. She looked up at him. I'm asking to understand the downstream human consequences of the strategic decisions I'm making, because I need to be able to make them with full information, or I'm just a mechanism. You're not a mechanism. I know I'm not. That's why I'm telling you I need this. He held her gaze. Done, he said. The same word he'd used in the conference room in New York when she'd asked him to limit his own access to her work. The same directness. No negotiation, no qualification. Just done. She nodded. They sat for another moment. What happened with Ashworth, she said. The board review. I want the full picture of where the organization lands. Ashworth and the 2 board members who were aligned with Knox have agreed to a governance restructure. The board will expand from 7 members to 9, 2 new independent seats, external appointments, no organizational affiliation. He turned his coffee cup on the table. The same unconscious gesture she'd picked up herself, she realized, in the months of sitting across tables from him. It makes the board harder to control informally, harder for any one relationship cluster to dominate. That weakens your position. It strengthens the organization. She looked at him. Is that... She stopped. What? Is that something you decided before or after I came into this building? He was quiet for a moment. After, he said. She absorbed that. The Frey situation, she said. The board members he was protecting. Are they fully removed or just restructured? Fully removed. Frey's resignation triggered a review of the division he was overseeing. There were 3 additional people in that structure who were running the same play at smaller scale. All 3 are gone. And the people below them who were on the receiving end of it. Luca looked at her directly. I was hoping you would want to be involved in what happens to those people. She held his gaze. There are 11 employees identified in the review, he said. People whose contributions were systematically misattributed over periods ranging from 8 months to 6 years. The legal question of remedy is relatively straightforward, but what those people actually need, he stopped. Let the sentence sit open. Is not primarily legal, she said. No. She looked at the table. She thought about the 22nd floor, the stairwell between 18 and 19, the flickering fluorescent light and the 4 maintenance requests and the email asking whether she was full-time or contract. She thought about the specific texture of being competent and invisible, of generating value that never returned to you in any form you could use. I'll handle it, she said. I know. 12. She flew back to New York 3 days later, alone. Luca stayed in Singapore for a follow-up with the Pacific delegations that required another week. They said goodbye in the hotel lobby with the economy of people who know each other well enough that goodbyes don't require a lot of staging. He held her face in both hands for a moment. He looked at her. Careful, he said. It was not the word she expected. Not call me or I'll be back soon or any of the normal vocabulary of parting. Just careful, with the weight of someone who meant it as a complete sentence. Always, she said. She flew home. Done. The New York autumn had moved deeper while she was away. The trees in the park near her apartment had gone full color, orange and rust and the particular sharp yellow that only lasts a week before it turns brown, and the mornings had the cold bite of a season that means business. She walked to the office the first morning back because she needed the air and the noise and the specific quality of the city's indifference, which she had always found, paradoxically, clarifying. The 11 employees identified in the Frey Review were scattered across 4 divisions. Some were still with the organization. 3 had left in the past year. 1 had been pushed out directly. 2 had done what Vivian had almost done, reached a point of exhaustion and walked. She started with the ones who were gone. The first conversation was a phone call with a woman named Priya Anand, 34, who had spent 5 years in the consortium's finance division before leaving 8 months ago. The conversation lasted an hour and a half. Vivian sat at her desk and listened, really listened, the way she had been listened to in an amber-lit office on a rainy night, while Priya talked about the specific accumulated weight of 5 years of professional theft, the way it erodes not just your career trajectory, but your basic confidence in your own perception of reality, your ability to trust what you know you know. When Priya finished, Vivian said, "I want to offer you a path back in, if you want it. Different division, different reporting structure, and a formal attribution framework that didn't exist before. You'd be walking into something that was built partly because of what happened to you." A long silence on the other end. "Why?" Priya said finally. Not hostile, genuinely asking. "Because you shouldn't have had to leave," Vivian said, "and because this organization owes you something it can't fully repay, and this is the most honest version of trying." Another silence. "Send me the details," Priya said. She made 10 more calls over the following 2 weeks. 7 of the 11 said yes in various forms, on various timelines. The other 4 were not ready, or had built something elsewhere they weren't willing to leave, or were simply not interested in returning to any version of this building, which Vivian understood completely and respected without argument. She documented every conversation. She built a formal proposal, not just for these 11 cases, but for a structural attribution policy across the organization with specific mechanisms for tracking contribution at every level, independent of seniority, tied to compensation review. She brought it to the board at the November governance meeting. Ashworth, in his new cooperative capacity, voted for it. It passed 7-2. Luca came back from Singapore on a Thursday, 11 days after she did. She was in her office at 9:30 in the evening. She was almost always in her office at 9:30 in the evening, when she heard footsteps in the hallway that she recognized by their particular pace and weight before they reached her door. She was looking at her screen when the door opened and she looked up and he was there, still in his travel jacket, with his bag over one shoulder and the specific exhaustion of someone who has been on a plane for too many hours and has not yet decided whether to sleep. She looked at him. He looked at her. "The attribution policy," he said. "I read the board minutes." 7-2, she said. "Who voted against?" "Reese and Cardwell, both new appointments. They had concerns about the administrative overhead." She paused. "I'm having lunch with Cardwell next week." Something moved through his expression. "Of course you are." She closed her laptop. She stood. She walked around the desk and stopped in front of him and looked at his face. The tiredness in it. The 11 days of complicated work in Singapore sitting in the lines around his eyes. The jaw that was always slightly tighter than it needed to be. She said, "Are you all right?" He looked at her for a moment. "I will be." She heard her own words from the ballroom wing coming back in his voice, and something in her chest did the complicated thing it had been doing since approximately the 3rd week of October. "Come on," she said. She got her jacket. They went down the elevator and out of the building into the cold November night and walked, not toward anything specific, just walked, the way the city allows if you let it, moving through lit blocks and dark ones, past the deli on 54th that was inexplicably always open, and the small park between 2 office buildings where someone had put a bench that faced the wrong direction, and it somehow always had someone sitting on it. They walked for 40 minutes and talked about Singapore, about the delegation outcomes, about a supply chain issue in the Milan node that had surfaced while he was gone, about the Priya Anand call and the 6 other yeses and the 4 people who had said no in ways she'd respected. They talked the way they always talked, like two people thinking through the same problem from different angles. The conversation doing the particular efficient thing it did when both people in it are paying full attention. At some point, without planning it, they stopped walking. They were on a block she didn't immediately recognize, residential, quieter than the avenue they'd come off. His hand had found hers at some point in the past 10 minutes, and she wasn't sure when exactly, but it was there, and she wasn't inclined to question the timeline. She looked at the building across the street. Someone's lit window, 4 floors up. Someone moving around a kitchen. "I've been thinking about the people who said no," she said. "The 4 who didn't want to come back." "Yes." She watched the lit window. "I keep trying to figure out if there's something I should have said differently. Something that would have, but then I think that's the wrong question. Some things can't be fixed. Some damage is just damage, and the most honest thing is to not pretend the repair is complete when it isn't." He was quiet for a moment. "That's true of most things." She looked at him. "Is it true of you?" He met her eyes. The question sat between them in the cold air. Not hostile, not an accusation, just honest in the way she had gotten into the habit of being honest with him, directly and without softening, because he had never once used her directness against her. "Some of it," he said. "Yes. The parts that aren't fixed. The 11 years before you walked into my office." He said it without performance, without the protective detachment she'd watched him use with everyone else in every room she'd seen him in. Just flat truth, offered with both hands. "The way I ran things. The way I thought about people, as variables. Resources. Problems to manage." A pause. "I was good at it. That's the part that's hardest to sit with. Not that I was doing it wrong. That I was doing it right, and it was still the wrong thing to be doing." She held his gaze. "The board restructure," she said. "The attribution policy. The 11 employees." "Yes. Those aren't penance." "No," he said. "They're just better." He looked at the lit window across the street. "You don't fix what you were. You just try to build something that isn't that." She thought about the resignation letter. She thought about the 22nd floor and the stairwell and the 4 years of swallowed fury. She thought about what it cost a person to keep going through the motions of a life that is slowly grinding them into something unrecognizable, and the specific courage, she called it that now, she had stopped calling it stubbornness, of the night she finally stopped. "I almost didn't go up," she said. He looked at her. "In the elevator, the first night. I pressed the up button and the elevator came and I almost didn't get in." She looked at their hands. "I've thought about that a lot. What the version of me who didn't get in looks like right now." "Smaller," he said quietly. She looked up at him. "The version of you who didn't get in," he said. "She would have gotten smaller, year by year, the way people do when they keep swallowing things that should have been said." She thought about that. "And you? I would still be running the machine," he said. "Well, efficiently, without this. The word covering everything and nothing. The two of them on a residential block in November with their hands together and the city going on around them in its total and beautiful indifference. "That's a lot of weight to put on one elevator decision," she said. "Yes," he agreed, and then quietly, "I'm glad you got in." She looked at him for a long moment. At the tiredness in his face and the realness underneath it, the man beneath the machine, the one who had been there the whole time and had needed, apparently, a woman with a resignation letter and nothing left to lose to walk through a door and find him. She leaned into him. His arm came around her. They stood on the quiet block in the cold and looked at nothing in particular, and it was enough. More than enough. It was the specific and unhurried fullness of two people who have stopped performing and are simply present. After a while, she said, "The Milan supply chain issue. I looked at it this afternoon." He laughed. It was a short, real, unguarded sound that she had heard exactly 3 times before and had been collecting without meaning to. "Of course you did. There's a bottleneck in the third-party logistics node outside Brescia. I think it's a contract structure problem, not an operational one. Send me the analysis." "I will." She paused. "Tomorrow." "Tomorrow," he agreed. They walked back toward the office building, not because either of them had more work to do tonight, but because it was the direction they'd come from, and sometimes that's the only reason you need. The city was doing its late-night thing, quieter, but not quiet. The volume reduced to a sustain rather than a peak. The kind of urban sound that is almost comfortable once you've lived inside it long enough. She thought about what came next, not with anxiety, just with the forward-looking quality that had always been the engine of how she moved through the world. The inability to stand still without thinking past the present moment. There was the Milan contract review. There was the Atlantic Division strategy that Luca had asked her to develop and that she'd been turning over in the back of her mind for 2 weeks. There were the 7 returning employees to integrate, the attribution framework to implement, the Cardwell lunch, the ongoing board governance process. There was the full spectrum of it, the complicated and the clean, the part she was proud of, and the part she was still learning to hold without flinching, the world she had walked into on a rainy Thursday night and decided, against every reasonable argument, to stay inside. She was still inside it. She had chosen to stay every day since, with full information and open eyes, which was the only way she knew how to choose anything. The building came into view ahead of them. The lobby lights. The night security at the desk, who had been there every late evening she'd ever worked. A quiet man named Douglas, who always nodded and never asked why people were coming and going at these hours, which she had come to understand as a kindness. Luca pushed the lobby door open and held it for her. She walked through. Douglas nodded. She nodded back. The elevator came. They got in. The doors closed. The floor numbers moved. She looked at the number above the door. 22, 23, 24. And she thought about the first night, the same numbers in reverse. The descent from the 31st floor with her heart doing something irregular, and the torn resignation letter in the wastebasket, and the word Monday sitting in the air of the elevator like a promise she hadn't fully decided to keep yet. She had kept it. Every Monday since. And every day between the Mondays. Not because it had been easy. It had been the hardest sustained thing she had ever done. Harder than the 4 years below it, which at least had the clarity of being simply wrong in ways she could name. This was complicated and demanding and morally textured in ways that required her full adult attention every single day. And some days the full adult attention was not enough. And she made decisions she had to go back and revise. And some of those revisions were costly, and some of the costs were not yet fully paid. But she was here. She was present. She was, for the first time in her adult working life, operating at the full capacity of what she actually was, rather than the diminished version that 4 years of systematic erasure had almost convinced her was all she had. The elevator reached 31. The doors opened. She walked out into the hallway with its thick carpet and amber wall sconces, and the particular quality of quiet that belonged exclusively to this floor at this hour. Her office. His office. The conference room where they had worked through more mornings than she could count. She stopped at her office door. He stopped beside her. She looked at the gold-edged keycard in her hand. She thought about the blue one that had come before it, and the temporary window code before that, and the elevator on the night of the storm, and the woman who had stood in the rain on 6th Avenue afterward with her hair soaked through, shivering, already changed in ways she didn't have the vocabulary for yet. She had the vocabulary now. She turned to Luca. "Get some sleep," she said. "You too." "I will." She put her hand briefly against his chest. Not a gesture of romance, just contact, the simple human fact of two people acknowledging each other at the end of a long stretch of days. "We have work tomorrow." "We always have work tomorrow." "I know," she said. "I like it." He looked at her. That look. The one that was not ownership or strategy or calculation. The one that was just her. Just the fact of her existing in this hallway, in this building, in this life they had built together inside all the difficulty of it. "So do I," he said. She opened her office door. She sat down at her desk. She opened her laptop. The city spread out beyond the glass, all 31 floors of it between her and the street, all the lit windows and the dark ones and the rain that had started again sometime while they were walking, quiet against the glass, the same rain that had been falling the first night and every difficult night since. She began to work, not because she had to, not because stopping felt dangerous anymore, not because the work was the only thing standing between her and the version of herself that was smaller and quieter and had almost believed the story other people told about her. She worked because she wanted to, because the problems in front of her were real, and she was the right person for them, and she knew it in a way that had nothing to do with anyone else's confirmation. The rain came down. The city held. Vivian Carter, strategic advisor, executive floor. Moretti Consortium, the woman who had almost not gotten in the elevator, put her hands on the keyboard and got to work. And somewhere 4 doors down the hall, Luca Moretti sat at his own desk in the amber light, with his notepad and his cramped handwriting and the city behind him, doing the same. 2 people, separately and together, building something out of the wreckage of what they'd each almost let themselves become. That was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything.